Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm thankful to have Ann Morris and Frances Frei with me today. Ann is a leadership coach and the executive founder of the Leadership Consortium, a leadership accelerator that unleashes the potential of participants to lead at senior levels of a global organization. Frances is a professor at Harvard Business School and is also a former senior vice president of leadership and strategy at Uber. They are both co authors of Unleashed, a book on the practice of leadership today, and Uncommon Service, a book on the importance of service in business. Anne and Frances, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here.
And thanks for having both of us.
Of course, thankful to have you on. So, if you could each, set the scene for us, take us back to your beginnings, where you grew up, your family situation, and the type of kid you were.
Wow, what a great place to start.
What kind of kid were you, Anne?
I was a weird little kid. I was born, I actually had a rough entrance into the world. I was technically born without a heartbeat on the banks of the Mississippi River in St. Louis, Missouri. And the medical team was not optimistic that I was going to make it. I wasn't breathing. I had no heart rate. I was a surprise breech baby. So I came out feet first. It was not the last surprise that I introduced to the Morse family. But yes, I made it. And my parents were told that I was unlikely to have normal cognitive functioning. And so the first couple years, it was touch and go, mainly from my mother, not really sure what I could handle, which has become a great source of family humor. That she didn't want to give me normal toys, so she would give me
for fear of overloading,
for fear of overstimulating me. I would be confused by what to do.
Interesting.
So I got lots of spoons and things that I couldn't injure myself with. But they figured out eventually that I was hanging in there.
Yeah.
And I think when I graduated from Harvard Business School, I believe my mother tracked down the physician.
Wow. Yeah.
Fran Morris,
who brought me into the world and
give him an I told you so.
Yeah, to not even try. Yeah. So then I was grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My father died at a pretty young age. I was 2 years old. So we moved back to where my mother had grown up and where her family was. And she raised the three of us on her own, which was, in retrospect, Frances and I have 2 kids, and as much help and assistance as we can possibly afford. Yeah. When I think back to,
a single mom
making it work, it's really extraordinary. And I have so much, speaking of the gratitude team, so much gratitude for her vulnerability and willingness to do whatever it takes to raise the 3 of us.
Do you remember the first time you were aware of, like, was it at a young age at like 4 or 5, or was it later on at like when you were a teenager?
The aware that
your mom was a single mom, because I mean at 2 at that point that become, I mean, I'm not sure you had that many memories, so growing up with your mom must have seemed normal. But then when you go to like, a school event or something like that, or parent teacher conference, I'm sure
it's a great question. I don't remember when that part hit me for the first time. I was the youngest. I was the only girl. And I think my brothers played a quasi-parental role in my life. So I felt, that said, I was recruiting attention from the adults around me, I think from a young age. I was pretty strategic about winning over the teachers in my life. So I think I went out and recruited, I think maybe filled in some of the gaps that I needed. I think I was a scrappy child in that sense. I think I was aware that I did not fit squarely into the assumptions about about gender. So I am, a proud cis woman married to a woman. But I was aware that the kind of the little box in Cincinnati, Ohio for little girls, that
just didn't seem big enough for you.
It didn't fit. It wasn't a perfect fit.
Yeah.
So I remember being aware of that at a pretty young age. The things I was interested in doing, the sports I was interested in playing, the way I spent my time. I spent a lot of time imagining that I was fighting in the American Revolution, which is a pretty weird for any gender. So I'm not sure there is a box where that fits cleanly. That was a point. It was irrelevant as a young child. It was a point of tension to me around middle school and kind of when you kind of go through puberty and you spend a lot of time wanting to be like your peers, and then ultimately a point of pride and distinction as I grew into myself and got older. Go ahead.
No, continue.
Yeah. So where did we start? What kind of a little kid? I think growing up in high school in Cincinnati, Ohio, I was in a pretty conservative town, in a pretty conservative school. And I resisted, I resisted that culture. And I think very much defined myself in contrast to that. Went off to Brown University, which was not
before you get there. So,
yeah.
This is even in today's culture, throughout the world, being gay isn't widely accepted. So, for you, I guess, what was the first time maybe you realized that you were attracted to women?
Yeah, I don't know that I could cleanly define it. I was definitely, I identified as straight well into my 20s. So I don't think I coded my connections with women, certainly not romantically or in terms of attraction, until I think much later, certainly by Gen Z standards, appallingly late.
Yeah.
So I think I would have gotten there much faster if I were growing up in today's world. And I think that it's so hard to quantify that gift, and it actually takes discipline for me to not code those chapters in my life as the lost years.
Yeah.
And the fact that I was not out at Brown, what a tragic lost opportunity that was. But I had, and I want to say for the record, I had wonderful relationships with men. And I think I realized that the kind of pattern emerged in the depth of my connection. That pattern led me towards women romantically. But I do experience the fluidity of that spectrum, and I have in my life, in a world that likes you to, pick a team and pick a category and make it simple and stay there. And I'm, I don't feel a lot of tension around that, those expectations in terms of gender, sexuality, other forms of identity. I've never fit perfectly into the box, and I'm quite comfortable with that now. I understand why those boxes exist. I understand why, as human beings, we need to make sense of the world, and we are pattern seeking and meaning seeking machines. And so I don't, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And with the reality that it doesn't explain or illuminate a lot of my experience in the world.
Yeah.
Those categories are only somewhat useful, and they're kind of guideposts.
It was interesting the other day. Actually, one of my friends, came out to me as bi, and it was interesting because one of our other friends had said, I'm glad you told me, but it's not a big, it's not in my business. It's not a big deal for me. And I thought, oh, that's interesting that, that's something straight people don't have to do, but it's something, I guess, you know, people that aren't straight feel like they need to at some point come out.
Right.
But I guess so. I don't want to harp too much on it, but for you, I mean, if it didn't come out in Brown, I guess when did it come out? And when
when did the door open?
Yeah, because that one would think. Yeah, it was. It's fun. I used to do a lot of work in global health, so that's where I started my career in Latin America, and I fell in love with a colleague who was on one of those projects with me, and we had a long relationship. At least it felt like that at the time. I think it was not coincidental that we were both in another country, kind of far from home, working in another language, working in another culture, where kind of we weren't tied down by our identities in the way that we were in kind of our home culture. So there was space for exploration, and space to trust myself, and play and just be a human being, I think, in ways that are harder when you're trying to stay in your own lane. So, and I was older and knew myself more, better at that point than as a 17-year-old kid. Maybe when those fleeting moments of like, why can't I breathe around this person? Like, I think by that point in my life, I could figure out what that maybe meant, as a 27-year-old that I couldn't as a 17-year-old. So, I think they probably were not lost years in the way that I sometimes think about them.
I guess as you look at your journey, if there's someone out there struggling, with finding themselves or something of that nature, I mean, do you have any pieces of advice for them?
Oh yeah. I think, the process of coming out was actually as hard as I thought it would be, in terms of coming out to my family. And I think what I underestimated was the change in my relationship with myself on the other side of that decision. The power of that, the way that the courage and authenticity and clarity I found walking through that fire also gave me courage and authenticity and clarity in other parts of my life beyond just this narrow lane of, who you're going to go home with.
Yeah.
Right. In my work and creativity and thinking about who I wanted to be in the world, thinking about how to take up space in the world, thinking about my voice, how I wanted to use it, how I wanted to influence the world. What was I going to stand for? What was I going to be a space? All those things were profoundly changed by my willingness to own this part of me that I had been, I think in retrospect, very protective of, and had given away so much power to other people to decide my own worthiness. And to take some of that power back, I think I underestimated what that would do for my entire life, not just my romantic life.
What was the hardest part? Was it telling family?
For me, it was telling family. For me, it was the conversation with my mother, who had sacrificed so much for me to be happy, and go out in the world and, conquer, slay whatever dragons there were to be slayed. And I knew that she would be afraid for me. I knew that she would worry about how the world would receive me. I think more than I feared her judgment, I feared the feelings that I was going to provoke in her. And I knew she would think that she had failed in some way, that she had failed me in some way. And I knew that would be one of the fires that she would have to walk through and get to the other side of. And that broke my heart.
Yeah. All right. So Francis, so we'll stop. Anne's right at Brown. We'll catch up. We'll get you up to 18. So
Jeez.
tell us about.
I'm dating male rowers from Eastern European countries that no longer exist. That's where we're going to leave our superhero at Brown.
And so I'm to pick up at which age?
0 to 18.
Oh my.
Yeah. Let's talk about your childhood,
Uh,
what you were
yeah.
like as a kid.
So I didn't ever fit into any category, whether it was gender, sexuality, or anything. I grew up youngest of 6 kids. My mom was 25 when she had me, so it was one every 15 or 16 months or so for from 18 to 25. And so we grew up in a town where you could open the door and the kids could run out, the dogs could run out. It was sort of free range doing that. So I was always playing sports. So the two things I was good at was that I was pretty good at math and I was pretty good at sports. And so I felt comfortable when I was doing those two things. And otherwise I felt pretty uncomfortable, but didn't dwell on it a lot. Just didn't feel comfortable. And so muddled my way through, I think in socially unremarkable ways. I remember graduating from high school or finishing high school work, and like I didn't go to high school graduation or anything. I just got in a car and left.
Yeah.
And I went to basketball camp. And that was my sport of choice at the time. And then that's when I also fell in love with a woman for the first time. I mean, there was no hint of being straight prior to then. I don't ever recall it. I don't ever recall coming out to anyone. I've just always been who I am, which is a pretty awkward person.
Yeah.
But it was basketball camp, which was the place where I fell in love for the first time. And then that became a big part of my identity. And then that went into college, and so math and basketball were the two, things.
This is the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So statistically, I think most lesbians in America at some point had swung by basketball camp.
Oh, all of the basketball coaches are crying right now.
Yeah. How was your process with, was it something that you felt like you needed to tell people? How was your process?
Honestly, remember trying to tell somebody once, and it was such an uneventful thing. I just never bothered again. It's
really
like literally who I was in the world. I simply was. So I don't have a coming out story. I don't recall ever coming out. Just always just being me. I've never been burdened by it. Like, if I was in love with someone, I was delighted to talk about them. Like it didn't seem unusual. It didn't seem any more unusual than I already was to me. So I think that the box of being gay fit me very well. Gender boxes didn't fit me, but it was not like, oh, there was no, oh, it was like, oh. So just as natural as anything else.
But you never felt like the parental pressure to bring a guy back home for Thanksgiving or something like that?
I never felt parental pressure.
Wow. That's awesome.
For anything.
Yeah.
I think is
part of one advantage of being the youngest.
One advantage of being the youngest. You get forgotten a lot.
Yeah.
But certainly no. And I didn't grow up in a household. Well, I actually have no idea if my siblings felt parental pressure. I didn't feel any for anything.
Yeah.
Are you the most ambitious of your siblings?
It is the only thing I am the most of my siblings. I'm not the smartest. I'm not the funniest. I'm not the most creative, but I am by far the most ambitious.
Where do you think that?
I'm the most competitive. Well, actually, it's a pretty competitive.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty competitive family.
Yeah. So I'm not even sure I'm the
I
most.
think your mother is the most.
My mother is the most competitive. Yeah.
Where did your ambition come from, do you think?
I don't have any idea, but I do have a very vivid memory I lived on a hill, and I walked down the hill. The bottom of the hill, there was a local store, and I was 12, and I asked for a job, and the person said, when do you want to work? And I said, from 8 to 12 every day, there's no school. So on the weekends and every day in the summer. And they were like, well, how much do you want to be paid? And I said, $1.25 an hour. And they said, yes. So I remember every time I worked 16 hours, I got a $20 bill. And I worked every day. There was no school from that time through college. I just always worked.
Child labor laws notwithstanding.
not in that little town.
I was gonna say that, in terms of, because Anne, you went to Brown, yeah,
Yes.
and then Francis, you went to
Penn.
UPenn.
Yeah.
You know, in high school, for you guys, from an academic perspective, where does your drive come from?
I was never a good student. I didn't get into Penn my first time. I never get anything the first time. And please say yes to Anne the first time. You won't get a second opportunity. But I don't, nobody says yes to me the first time. I applied to Penn and I didn't get in. And so I went to a school called Brandeis my first year. And that was the first time I can recall being in just misery. And then transferred to Penn. But it was because I was smart. So in retrospect, I think I was objectively smart, but I wasn't a good student. Like I wasn't seeking out relationships with the teachers or approval from the teachers. I never sought approval from anyone. In fact, could I have just looked for a little approval, a little bit? I had a chip on my shoulder from a young age that took till an old age at some point in the future to go away.
Yeah, that's awesome. What about you, Anne?
Yeah, I came from an academically achieving family, not super high achieve. I mean, in kind of a waspy sense. I mean, I rebelled by not going to, Princeton, Yale, or Harvard. Actually, by not going to Princeton. That was an act of rebellion. I think so that there was an expectation. I mean, there was kind of an unspoken contract with my single mother that as long as I achieved in school, I could do anything else I wanted. And that was a deal I was very willing to make. It seemed totally reasonable to my 15, 16, 17-year-old brain. I think one of the gifts of growing up in an environment where you don't fit exactly is you pick your head up and you look around and you get very interested in the rest of the world. At a young age, and often younger than your peers. So I do remember moments in my adolescence, fights with friends or fights with my mom, or where I would think to myself, I can't wait to get out there in the world. And that brought me a lot, that there was another world out there with different assumptions, different languages, different cultural norms. I think that brought me a lot of comfort. And I was really restless to get out there.
Yeah, I recall being quite a justice warrior inside One Oliver Road, the house I grew up in.
Yeah.
And there was plenty to fight with on it. But and then also this knowing I was leaving the second I could to a broader world.
Yeah. And I think that for me, it presented also in a little bit of a justice warrior identity. Yeah. I was just telling our boys the story the other day. So this is an example. There was a rumor in our neighborhood that there was somebody who did not want to sell their house to an African-American family because the property values would go down. And so I thought it was a good idea to spray paint on the street in front of that house something like end racism now in the middle of the night. I just thought that like made a lot of sense. And so no one knew who did it. Right. So there was this, but my mother knew exactly who did it. But she couldn't prove it. Yeah. And there were no empty spray paint bottles. And I denied it. But it was, I walked around with that kind of energy. And, there were administrators, I was beloved by some teachers and who were cheering me on in my little conservative high school. And,
not so much by administrators.
Not so much by, and the headmaster and I had a moment of truth the day after graduation, and all I could do in that conversation was not cry. That was like the most, I felt so triumphant because I got out of his office without crying when he told me how, disappointed my mother was in me. I had just given a speech that was more political than it needed to be on graduation day.
Yeah.
So I think I was looking for an outlet for this, and my judgment wasn't great. But I was also on the first, on the first emotional train out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I was ready to take it.
Yeah. Could you imagine if either of our children wanted to leave when they were 17? We'd follow them.
I'd buy the spray paint. It's so different. I have no idea because it's so developmentally appropriate to rebel.
Yeah.
And we, they have two parents with this kind of maverick energy. I don't know what it's going to look like.
Yeah. What would rebelling look like?
They're going to be Boy Scouts. They're going to be total Boy Scouts.
And that will be rebelling.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but maybe that gives you some of the texture.
Yeah. Actually, and Francis, I didn't ask you this. Obviously, you seem to have had a better headspace about it. But I asked Anne if she had any advice. But do you have any advice for anyone out there that's struggling with, being their true self in terms of their sexuality?
I mean, anytime if I find out that somebody's gay, I say congratulations. I think it's lovely. I think it means you're in touch enough with yourself enough that you know that. I think it's something to be celebrated. You heard the tremendous empathy Anne had for her mom's feelings. I probably didn't have that much empathy for other people's feelings, but it wasn't like Anne was worried for Anne. She was worried for her mom's feelings. And so I would just say to the person, congratulations, there's a beautiful world out there. And I expect the world that they grow up in to be more queer than not if we take all of the varieties and all of the fluidity.
Yeah.
I just think that the super gendered, super straight, super this is a thing of the past, and probably wasn't even a thing of the past. I don't even think we're going to bother claiming it for much longer.
Yeah.
So I would say congratulations and welcome.
Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is this Ken Barbie world does not work for most humans, does not work for most men, does not work for most women. And I think that tension is it's just super unproductive if you look back historically. So I'm excited about the present, and I'm crazy excited about the future when it comes to identity.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So, Anne, why don't you talk about, what you were thinking about maybe academically and professionally as you enter Brown, and what you did after Brown?
Yeah. So I found my community, and I began to get my kind of work mojo in summer work I was actually doing with an organization called Amigos. And it was a kind of a mini Peace Corps that partnered with local organizations, primarily in Latin America. And the partnership was year round, but they would bring volunteer students down for the summer as a supplemental labor force. This organization, the experience had an enormous impact on my worldview and my conviction in this this idea of a universal humanity where we are all much more similar than different. And a lot of that was informed by doing health work in rural areas with humans who had a radically different life trajectory from me, and building deep friendships, and sharing the meals,
Yeah.
like laughter, effort to make a community better, finding resources, developing people, doing all of those things, and pursuing these goals that were so familiar to me. And to see a the pride a 70-year-old grandmother was taking on the Haitian border with her grandson learning to walk, seeing the same. And this sounds like such bullshit, right? But like seeing the light in her eyes that I had seen, back in a living room in Cincinnati, Ohio, in my own grandmother. I mean, that stuff hit me. I was in my 20s. It hit me at such a formative time.
And the work also ruined you for work.
Yeah,
afterwards.
it did in terms of expectation, because
it was so purposeful.
There was also the organization would give young people an incredible amount of responsibility. So at 22, I was running a project in the Dominican Republic. At 23, I had projects in 6 countries and, hundreds of volunteers that I was responsible for, and had to build partnerships, in 3 different languages, with public health organizations all over the world. So that,
and then somebody giving you a little case study in an interview to join a team of 5.
Just the degree of difficulty, the amount of energy, the humanity, all of that stuff in one role, in one experience at such a young age. I think I've been chasing that kind of meaning and satisfaction in a job ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really profound.
And I think you've learned you can't work for anyone else.
Yeah, I was probably wired to not be a great employee. Probably it may have something.
You're a serial entrepreneur. She creates great companies. People love working for her, but I just don't see it in the reverse.
Could have been my death and resurrection at a young age.
Yeah.
I felt yes. So I ultimately ended up in the entrepreneurial space, which had similar degrees of adrenaline, risk, stakes. And that's the sandbox that I really love. I love 0 to 1. I love the founder challenge. I spend a lot of time advising and coaching founders. And that's probably the most spiritually satisfying work that I do, because that creative moment, working with the team, pulling something out of nothing, and the way that changes the individuals who go on that ride is truly addictive for me, and it's my deepest pleasure to facilitate it in any way.
Yeah,
and we each have in common that we prefer going towards burning buildings than away from them.
Yeah. It's not something everybody has. And then in 2004, you went to Harvard Business School?
Yep. I wasn't sure the business school was going to be the right path for me. So I applied to one school and decided if they let me in, then this was the right path. And if they didn't, then, I should.
It's crazy.
It was, having now met Francis, it was a little crazy. I think your approach is much more reliable in terms of.
I don't let the decisions of a mortal influence my life trajectory, and you just left it all up to missions.
Yeah. So, but I loved it. I loved the dynamism of the classroom. I loved being surrounded by so many people with a bias for action. Um, it really felt like coming home in a really strange way that I was not expecting, having spent most of my career up to that date working on issues of poverty and global health.
What do you think? You know, every year, thousands of people are trying to get into HBS. What do you think in terms of why they accepted you? Um, do you have any pieces of advice for people um, on getting into HBS?
Yeah, I mean I think I had clarity around the impact I wanted to have on the world, and I think being able to articulate that and articulate where uh, conversation about organizations and learning how to create spaces where other people can thrive, which is our fundamental definition of leadership. That I think that helps a great deal. So, self-knowledge, um, and and awareness around what is it about the world that you want to go out and change, because you are an investment from the institution with the possibility of infinite return. So
Mm.
give them a sense of what that return is going to be.
And I would add to that, if I may, that
Yeah,
I wouldn't take it too personally if you get in, and I wouldn't take it too personally if you don't get in. What I mean by that is, if you get in, there's a measure of luck associated with it. And if you don't get in, it's a measure of just like who else happened to be applying, measure of things that are far beyond your control. I would not recommend applying to one business school.
Yes, don't do that, kids, for sure.
um, and each one, I mean, there's just dozens that are phenomenal. And so I wouldn't get too tied up in any single one.
yeah,
I agree with that 100%.
yeah. As you look as your time as a student, um, and post that, is there something that you would tell a current business student to take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean the community piece is really real. I know that is harder in this remote moment that we're all experiencing, but there are ways to build those relationships. I think when I look back on the value of that experience, was definitely the formal conversation in the classroom, but also the conversation, the larger conversation that happens outside the classroom. And I don't mean that in like a networking way or, you know, um, I just mean that it is a precious opportunity to pause your life and really engage with your peers about what meaningful work means to you. What is the world that we all want to live in? I think go go into it with a sense that is precious. That time to dwell in possibility with in a really deep way with peers who you respect. And I think the people who get the most out of not just business school but graduate experiences in general really go in with some humility around the preciousness of the opportunity.
I
Yeah.
would add that in my observation, people that get the most out of graduate school are those that sleep.
Interesting.
And
Yeah,
in,
do that too.
in,
Yeah.
in college,
Yeah.
it became a badge of honor to not sleep.
Yeah.
I rarely see people thrive in graduate school without sleeping.
Yeah. No, mental. Yeah. Um, I guess, Francis, we'll go to you now and catch up to grad school for you. So you are at UPenn, and you want to just talk about what you maybe studied at UPenn and what you did after that?
Math and basketball.
Yeah.
So I played on the basketball team. I played softball for a year, but that was very boring. But I played on the basketball team. Continue to go to basketball camp every summer.
Yeah.
For sure. And then studied, they called it computer math at the time, but it was math and computer science was just beginning. And so math with a sprinkling of that wasn't any big decision for me of, oh, what should I major in? There was only one thing I could do at the college level, which was math. I remember graduating. Wasn't a very particularly good student, didn't particularly like going to class. And the only thing I knew when I graduated, I was so happy because I never had to go back to school again. And then I went and got a job and looked around me, and all of these people were getting their masters part-time at night. And I was like, oh, I didn't even particularly want to go back. I didn't want to go back to school, but I happened to go work somewhere where people were going to school from 6 to 9 at night. And I'm ridiculously competitive, although not as competitive as Grandma Terry, but very competitive. So I got my master's part-time at night, taking classes 2 nights a week for 3 hours a night in 7-week spurts, which was quite a way to get your master's. And then I remember as I got towards the end of that, people who I had gone to college with were starting to apply for PhDs. I was like, come on, I don't want to go get my PhD. I didn't particularly enjoy getting my master's. And they were all going to get their PhDs in English and in history. I couldn't do any of that. So I applied to get my PhD in operations management, which was applied math. And when I went there, my full intention was that I was going to go be a college basketball coach. That's where my passion really was, athletics. So I thought I'll get my PhD, won't tell anyone that that's what I'm going to do, but that's what I'm going to do. And then playing basketball, getting my PhD, I severely hurt my knee. And for whatever reason, that was the wake-up call to me that I should probably take academics seriously and probably put away even though why my knee hurting would have anything to do with my being a coach. But that was a total wake-up call for me. It was really, everyone in my life had known me as an athlete. I had known me as an athlete. I mean, I did education on the side, but it wasn't the center. And so that was a really big darn deal for me.
And at that time, I mean, the WNBA wasn't even
No.
around. Yeah.
No, thank goodness. Because I think I found out where I'm supposed to be, and that would have been a shiny object I would have wanted to chase. And I wouldn't have been that good, but probably like resilient enough to hang on. And so I'm quite grateful that didn't happen. Yeah, so that was where I forgot the question.
Yeah. No. I was just asking about up to your graduate work. So,
Can I point out a gap in the story?
Yeah.
Francis, you mentioned you did education on the side. What was that like the first time you were in a classroom?
Oh, well, when I first taught, so when I was getting my PhD at Wharton, and that's when I got hurt, and that's when my identity really changed. But after that, I was teaching review sessions for a class, and it turned out that was good. I was good at that, and so Wharton was a big program, and most of the students would come to my review sessions whether or not they would go to class. And so then there was an opportunity for me to teach, which was unusual for a PhD student to get the opportunity to teach. I think somebody got sick or something. And I taught for the first time. And then I was like, oh, this is where I belong. And I remember the feeling I had. I just have to give people a compelling reason to go to class, because I have always hated class. And so I thought really hard about how to give people a compelling reason to go to class. And then that was beautiful. And that, I think, changed everything. Then I was an educator. And if that meant I had to finish my PhD and I had to do all of this. And now, I mean, I became a coach. It's what I thought I was going to be. It's just I don't happen to coach athletics, although I have had the privilege of working with a few NBA teams. So every once in a while I get to coach in athletics, but mostly it's in leadership.
Yeah. And do you want to talk about after HBS? I saw Gene Peaks was one of the things you did. You want to talk about things like that?
Sure. So our oldest son, Alec, was born with a rare genetic disease called MCAD deficiency. It's
Wait, before you get there, how did you guys even meet?
oh, did we skip over that?
We did,
Yeah.
and we have like 5 minutes left. So
Oh man.
give the
All right,
good
all right.
version of the story.
Yeah. So I was an older student on the HBS campus. Francis
I was a
a
younger faculty.
dashing young faculty member. We overlapped briefly. There's a program before the campus, the first year begins, that was called analytics. We affectionately called it math camp. So for those of us who didn't have a deep analytics background, so we technically met, but we didn't get involved towards the end of the experience. And we were total Girl Scouts about it. I think
ridiculous.
Francis
When I
went to
look back,
the administration and just asked for guidance.
said, I've fallen in love with the student. What do I do?
And they told her what to do,
And they
which was
did. Super helpful, super clear. Do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
Go to these faculty meetings, don't go to those. Turns out all of you people out there, talk to the administration. Let them guide you.
that is our public service.
That is our
announcement.
public service announcement.
So, but it was thrilling. And it was clear that we were in it for the long haul early on, and kind of classic lesbian style. We had the moving van packed early in the trajectory of the relationship.
After, when I asked Anne to marry me, I first went out and asked her mother for permission in secret. And then my wedding band has inscribed on it, I'm a lucky shit. And that should describe how I feel about the dynamic.
Yeah.
And my wedding ring has a rock on it that just communicates that I'm a lucky shit without having to describe it.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, I forgot that we were only an hour. I guess, Francis, do you want to talk about being a Harvard Business School professor and things of that nature?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll finish the story.
Oh,
for
yeah, the
both of
story
us.
about your child.
Yeah.
Yes,
Anyway,
sorry.
so we got and so he's doing great. It's the one you want. He's thriving, but we learned a lot about genetics. And one of the things as a family we did, one of the things that was clear is that there had been a cultural break between the scientists and the medical practitioners that was very costly to medical practice. This is my,
Business brain.
this is my business brain, in the sense that the science was many years, I would argue, maybe even a decade ahead in terms of innovation than what was happening in medical practice. I think that gap has been closed now. I think there's so much exciting stuff happening in the space, but we got into that business to try to close that gap in an interesting way around screening, and can you learn early. We were actually working with sperm banks and egg banks around recessive diseases, and can you actually identify disease risk before actually making a donor selection? So it's a very
pre-pregnancy, which was
so it's
super exciting for us.
Yeah, and it's a way to intervene at the earliest possible point.
Yeah.
And actually reduce the burden of many of these diseases are horrific and life shortening and life threatening. And we got very lucky. Similar category of single gene disease, but much more manageable as kiddos get older. So I spent about a decade building that business.
And trying to educate the world.
Fantastic ride. Learned so much about company building. We ended up selling off the technology. The business itself wasn't a success, but we did great science and built great tech. And then I came to work with Francis full time. We had been doing it kind of after hours.
You had been doing it after hours.
I've been doing it after hours. And then together we spent a lot of time helping organizations who want to take a really ambitious swing at changing their organizations. And it's really gratifying work. I think Francis divides her time between changing lives in the classroom, which I think is your deepest calling, as an educator, and then bringing that calling out into the world and working with teams and executives.
And Anne and I we prefer writing together. We prefer working with teams together. Like if I'm not at HBS, I want to be working with Anne. We make each other better, and it's more fun.
And I think we have very complementary
Very.
skill sets and views of the world. I love language. I love the one-on-one kind of transformational conversation.
I love numbers and the one to many.
Francis
Yeah.
wants to be in either working on a spreadsheet or in a stadium filled with thousands. So between the two of us, we cover
a lot of ground.
most of the intervention points.
Yeah, yeah. Do you guys have a 5 o'clock, or can you continue?
We can maybe a few more minutes.
We have like 4 more minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I guess I didn't even get to have my questions, but
We can reschedule to
yeah,
continue another
'cause I
time.
feel like I didn't even talk about
Yeah.
the business part of.
But
But
why
I
don't we
guess-
do part 2? Why don't we
Yeah,
call this
why don't
part
we-
1?
We'll
Yes,
do part one, and
perfect.
then let's do part two. That sounds great.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right,
Okay.
sounds good. So
Awesome.
I'll talk to Natasha.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Bye, guys.
Anna.
Nice to meet you.
You
Nice
too.
to meet you.
Bye.
Thank you.